Hey folks, so I'd recently finished up The Messenger on stream and found myself itching to find another platformer to plunge into. As it stands, I lucked out with the somewhat recent release of MekaSkull's Cyber Shadow, a retro-flavored stab in the genre which I'd been low-key following for a while. That said, did this Shinobi Showdown wind up a rousing success, or did it simply provide an opportunity for my hopes and dreams to ninja vanish? I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. An explosion, an all-consuming light, pain, then nothing. When you returned to your senses, Mecha City lay in ruins, with nothing left to halt the vicious advance of the synthetic menace. And your body, it rests changed, flesh and blood replaced by the same cold steel that houses your foes. Everything is different, and yet your purpose remains the same. To avenge those of your clan who have fallen and rescue your master. And perhaps, when all is said and done, you may even learn why this happened. Okay, so, summary aside, I'm actually pretty fond of this game's story. The overarching lore is not only digestible, but also manages to incorporate some pretty authentic bits of drama into its narrative arc. Plus, whilst it might not be as perversely messed up as the transhumanist horror show that is Soma, Cyber Shadow's journey is far from cut and dry. There's still plenty of existential horror for you to mull over, to the point that I found myself questioning the nature of the protagonist more than a few times. To be fair, a large part of this because of my thirst for deep lore didn't just end with the requisite story scenes, as I went out of my way to seek out all the log entry terminals, which provide a lot of context for what's happened. It doesn't even just end there either. The NPCs are another rich source of world building, enough so that I was floored by some of the implications that are revealed when I discovered the hidden layer of my helper bot, Legion. I can only imagine what other narrative bombshells lay lurking within the game's labyrinthine corridors. Speaking of, Cyber Shadow is a ninja-themed action platformer, which, stop me if you've heard this before, also dabbles just a bit into the Metroidvania genre. But unlike its retro peer, The Messenger, it leans a bit more into Nintendo Heart territory. From the word go, things feel altogether more ruthless. Whether it's the enemy placement, their overall aggression, or simply the sheer lethality of, well, everything. And this intensified with each new area, as the addition of fresh new obstacles and enemies simply meant I could hurtle to my demise that much faster than before. And yet I was still spared from some of the more frustrating elements of that era. For one thing, the movement controls are tight, so while there are a challenging platforming sequence, it's due to the obstacles themselves, given that jumping feels so responsive. And sure, whilst there's no shortage of enemies to eradicate you, fissures to fall into, or spikes to be speared upon, the game eschews lives in favors of reusable checkpoints. You don't have to savor the sorrow of seeing the stages start. Instead, you'll end up facing a different sort of tragedy unique to this game's respawn stations. See, as you progress, you'll begin to encounter unpowered checkpoints, which lack certain functionalities, such as they'll only respawn you at half health, which can be absolutely killer once you start encountering them, since the only way to fix this is to collect essence from fallen foes, a currency solely used for restoring that functionality to checkpoints, as well as allowing them to do other things like replenish your energy or provide nifty sub-weapons. Small aside, the sub-weapons are actually pretty neat, ranging from offensive, like the Swag Blade Death Yo-Yo, to support options, like a shield that converts bullets into energy. There's a fair number to experiment around with, which can prove pivotal in boss fights. Plus, they last forever, provided you don't replace them or get hit 3 times, whichever happens first. But back to the checkpoints. The overall idea of modifying them is definitely interesting, but the fact that the cost ramps up in price meant there were more than a few instances where I found myself stranded in a challenging area, half dead, and constant risk of some obstacle or enemy finishing the job in a sparse few seconds or even one hit. Especially given your pitiful iframes. Pair this up with it happening near a boss fight or a section that provides little in the way of essence farming, and yeah, it's about as painful as you imagine. Probably more so, really, since the boss encounters in Cyber Shadow provides some genuine challenges and a fair amount of entertainment. Still, I could deal with the frustration given that each one represented a distinct conundrum to overcome, despite just how many lay lurking within the revel of Mecha City. Which is to say, all of the bosses are fantastically unique. What I'm trying to say, frankly, is I don't even actually think there would have been much of an issue at all, were it not for the fact that while there is a fast travel system, it's a bit persnickety. There's one teleporter at the start of each stage, so once you're mired in the thick of things, it can wind up feeling like a colossal task to double back towards that point. In fact, that's a large part of why I ended up waiting until close to the end game to do any real exploration. See, when I said Cyber Shadow dabbles at being a Metroidvania, I mean it. Whilst you do progressively acquire a growing set of abilities, which impact your offensive options, your mobility, and thus your ability to navigate its world at large, the exploration component is fairly straightforward, with only a select few secrets cached in each area. Does not say they aren't interesting, and they guard some of the most challenging platforming segments in the game, but that's essentially what they boil down to. Challenge rooms or small paths you can take on for a power-up and or some lore at the end. Suffice to say, the fact that I failed to find the last power-up and cap things off at a salty 97% completion made my progression to the final area all the more bitter, especially since I successfully predicted that there was going to be no easy way to get back once I'd committed to advancing forward. And I am serious when I say no easy way. The game really pulls out all the stops with the difficulty as you continue to make your way through its various stages, to the point that it wasn't entirely uncommon for me to spend a lot of time just dying over and over again while trying to master some of its trickier segments. If only so I could drag my broken body into a checkpoint and pray they would at least heal me to full, if I had the essence. And hey, if you've heard all this and decide the game isn't hard enough, there are feats. Essentially, these boil down to game achievements. While a few are readily accessible, the majority task you with daunting trials, like completing bosses without being hit, burning them down within a certain period of time. There's even one for getting through the game with a minimal amount of upgrades for the truly masochistic, or not dying until a certain point. At least when it comes to the aesthetics, I dig it. The graphics, I mean. They manage to evoke the same sort of warm, fuzzy feelings I get from playing Ninja Gaiden without needing me to blow on an NES cartridge to play. Plus, the story sequences are actually pretty darn rad looking. That said, between the two, I think I found myself more drawn to the game's soundtrack. There's a decent bit of variety to be found here, whether it's for the stage music or the many boss tracks. Overall, I was pretty down with this. Anyways, we're coming to a close, so let's kick off my final thoughts. And I have to say this game was bastard hard in segments. To the point that's hard to properly describe the feeling of palpable relief and satisfaction that washed over me when I finally reached the end. I'd made it. I was done. I had come face to face with a decidedly slick homage to my childhood nightmare, Ninja Gaiden. And I'd conquered it, albeit with some fresh platforming trauma to add to the pile. Now, don't get me wrong, there were plenty of times where I enjoyed the game, but there were also countless other examples where I found myself needing to take a deep breath and pray that I could find refuge from the rage. Whether it was some fiendish interplay of deadly enemies or just navigating networks of instant death spikes, the game had demands, excellence, near perfection, or just tears if you're hoping to find some refuge in iframes. Honestly, I think the challenge room's by far the worst offenders, especially a certain spiky elevator, which left me seething when I discovered that I couldn't attack in midair if I was holding a certain direction and had no SP. Still, as much as I have some pretty spicy feelings about the mechanics, I was incredibly fond of everything else. There's some pretty neat story beats to follow there, enough to build up genuine curiosity about its world. Sure, there is so much that is left unsaid, but there's enough there that I was genuinely invested in the overall fate of the character, as well as just what he was, who he was. That and the aesthetics are just swanky as hell. Ultimately though, I do think that Cyber Shadow is a good game. It does what it sets out to do, and does it rather well at that. Nonetheless, is it something that I would recommend to most people? Not as such, nor is it something that I'd be eager to dive back into for the reasons stated above. Ultimately, it's a bit of a fumble for me. Well crafted, gorgeous, but just an incredibly, exquisitely painful, frustrating experience, and one that would be most apt to appeal to those who want something to kick their teeth in and take their lunch money. Anyways, that's been this episode. I'd like to say a big thank you for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to leave a comment. And if you have an interest in supporting my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and just gaming content at large, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know there's a new release. There's also a Discord, links in the description, so you can become a part of our community, the Crit Hit Cauldron. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care until then, folks. Also, you can check me out at twitch.tv/Arlyeon if you actually want to see me go through these games live and die horribly.